John had never felt such fear before. His starship, a sleek vessel built for intergalactic travel, was crashing. The control panel blinked in and out, alarms blared loudly, and the ship shuddered with each violent shake. The skies outside were a swirling chaos of clouds and debris. He could see nothing but the endless storm and the violent force that pulled him downward. The last thing John heard before the metal hull hit the planet's surface was the ship's AI, Lena, trying to warn him. "Brace yourself, John. Impact imminent." And then everything went black. John woke up to pain. A sharp pain in his side, a heavy weight on his chest, and the smell of smoke. His eyes fluttered open, and he was greeted with a blurry image of twisted metal and flames. His hands were trembling as he pushed himself up, his heart racing in his chest. He could feel the weight of the wreckage pressing down on him, the cold alien air biting at his skin. It was hard to focus. The world seemed to spin around him as he tried to get his bearings. John's breath was shallow, panic rising within him. He couldn't remember much. The last few hours were a blur. He had been on a mission to explore distant galaxies, a part of a scientific team studying new worlds. But now he was on a strange planet, alone, with no way to communicate or contact Earth. The crash had destroyed everything. "Think, John. Think," he whispered to himself, forcing himself to stay calm. He needed to get out of the wreckage. Slowly, he crawled through the wreckage, using all his strength to push aside large pieces of the broken ship. His clothes were torn, and his body ached, but he kept moving forward. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, John managed to drag himself free from the ship. He looked around, blinking against the harsh sunlight of the alien world. He was surrounded by dense forests, tall trees that reached into the sky like towering giants. The air was thick with the smell of strange flowers, and the ground was covered in a soft, wet moss that felt strangely comforting beneath his boots. "Where am I?" John murmured to himself, trying to get a grip on his surroundings. The landscape was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The trees were unlike Earth's, with leaves that glowed faintly in the dim light. Massive plants rose up like columns, twisting toward the sky. It was beautiful, but it was also dangerous. He had no idea what kind of creatures roamed this planet. John stumbled forward, his legs weak from the crash, and his body aching all over. He needed shelter, water, food, but most of all, he needed to survive. The ship's computer had been damaged, and there was no way to contact Earth or even scan the planet for any sign of civilization. All he had were the supplies he could scavenge from the wreckage. As he walked deeper into the forest, John's thoughts raced. He couldn't stay here. The storm had destroyed the ship, and with no way to contact anyone, he was completely alone. He wasn't sure if anyone would ever come looking for him. This planet might be his tomb. After walking for several hours, John began to feel a strange sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The trees seemed to close in around him, and every rustle in the bushes sent a chill down his spine. He kept walking, hoping to find something, anything, that could help him. It wasn't until the sun began to dip below the horizon that he heard the first sound, a low growl. It came from behind him. John froze, his heart pounding. The growl was followed by another, and then another. He turned around slowly, searching the trees for the source. His breath caught in his throat as two glowing eyes appeared from the shadows. A creature emerged from the dark. It was large, its body covered in dark fur, and its claws glinted in the fading light. The creature sniffed the air, its sharp teeth visible as it snarled at John. Its body was built for strength, with muscles rippling under its fur. John's mind raced as he took a step back. He didn't have any weapons. The only thing he had was his wits. Before he could react, the creature lunged at him, but John was quicker. He dodged to the side, his body reacting instinctively. He grabbed a broken branch from the ground, holding it in front of him like a weapon. The creature snarled, its claws scraping against the ground. John didn't have time to think. He swung the branch, hitting the creature square in the face. The beast let out a roar of pain and staggered backward, but it wasn't enough. It came charging again, faster this time. John had only one chance. He took a deep breath, and with all the strength he could muster, shoved the branch forward. It struck the creature in the chest, knocking the wind out of it. The creature stumbled, its growl turning into a howl of frustration. John backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving the creature. He was breathing heavily, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. For a moment, he thought the creature would attack again, but then, unexpectedly, it stopped. The creature snarled once more before turning and disappearing back into the forest. John stood still for a moment, his heart still racing. He didn't know what had just happened, but he had survived. His hands were shaking, his breath ragged. He had to keep moving. If that creature was out there, he couldn't stay in one place for too long. He pushed forward into the darkening forest, feeling the weight of the alien planet's dangers pressing in on him. John didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: he had to survive. He had to find shelter. And maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to escape. John walked through the dense forest, his legs aching, and his mind racing. The sun had almost disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the world around him in a dim twilight haze. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stay where he had been. The creature he had encountered earlier had shown him just how dangerous this planet could be. He needed shelter, and he needed it fast. The eerie silence of the forest made John's every step feel heavier. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves and the occasional snap of a twig under his boots. He tried to focus on his surroundings, but every shadow seemed to hide something. His thoughts raced. Could he survive here alone? What kind of creatures lived on this world? And most importantly, how could he get back home? As John moved deeper into the forest, he began to feel like he was being washed. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his instincts screamed at him to keep moving. He glanced around, his eyes darting between the dark trees and thick underbrush. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was following him. Suddenly, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. His heart skipped a beat. John spun around quickly, his body tense and ready to fight. But there was nothing. Just the trees and the shadows. He wasn't sure if it was his imagination or if something truly was out there, but he wasn't about to take any chances. He began to walk faster, his pace quickening as he scanned his surroundings. Then, without warning, a figure stepped out from the shadows. John froze, his breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, but not like any woman he had ever seen before. She stood tall, her body covered in armor made of bones and animal hides. Her hair was long and wild, flowing like a black river behind her. Her eyes glowed an unnatural shade of gold, and her skin was darker than any human's, covered in strange tattoos that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. In her hand, she held a long spear, the tip sharp and deadly. John didn't know what to do. He was unarmed, and she was clearly a warrior. His heart raced as he tried to figure out if she was friend or foe. "Who are you?" John demanded, his voice firm despite the fear that gripped his chest. The woman didn't answer right away. She simply studied him, her piercing gaze never leaving his face. Then, without a word, she stepped forward, raising her spear as if to strike. John's pulse quickened, but before he could react, she spoke in a language he didn't understand. The words were harsh and foreign, the sounds sharp like the wind cutting through the trees. John raised his hands in surrender, trying to show he meant no harm. He spoke slowly, using simple English, hoping she might understand. "I'm not here to fight," he said, his voice calm but shaky. "I'm lost. Please, I need help." The woman cocked her head, clearly confused. She lowered her spear, but she didn't take her eyes off him. John realized that she might not understand him at all, but she seemed to sense something in his tone. Slowly, she reached out and touched his arm with surprising gentleness, as if testing him. Her touch sent a strange shiver down John's spine, and for a moment he wondered what kind of person, or creature, she was. Suddenly, more figures emerged from the shadows. John's eyes widened as he saw more women appear, each one as fierce and wild-looking as the first. They all wore similar armor, and they moved with the grace of hunters, their eyes watching John closely. There were at least a dozen of them, all surrounding him now. One of the women stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she examined John. She was taller than the rest, with a commanding presence that made her seem like the leader of the group. Her armor was more elaborate, adorned with beads and feathers that marked her status. John assumed she was their leader. She spoke, her voice low and filled with authority. Even though John didn't understand the language, he could feel the weight of her words. The group seemed to be discussing something among themselves, their conversation intense but not hostile. John's heart raced. He had no idea what they were saying, but he could tell that he was in a dangerous situation. He needed to act fast before they decided what to do with him. He had no weapons. He was alone, but he wasn't about to go down without a fight. The woman who had first approached him, the one with the spear, stepped closer. She raised a hand to him, as if offering him something, but John couldn't tell what it was. He had no choice but to trust her, at least for now. "Please," John said again, his voice softer this time. "I'm human. I'm lost. I don't want any trouble. I just need to survive." The leader woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, with a sharp gesture, she motioned for John to follow her. The group turned and began to move, their pace steady and sure, as if they expected John to obey without question. John hesitated for a second, but then he realized he had no other option. He had no way of surviving on his own in this strange world, especially with the danger lurking around every corner. With a deep breath, he followed them, hoping that they weren't leading him into something worse. As they walked through the dense forest, John couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. These women, whoever they were, seemed to be part of some tribe. He didn't know if they were friendly or if they would turn on him at any moment. But one thing was clear: he was no longer in control of his fate. He was a stranger in a savage land, and he would have to navigate their world by their rules. It wasn't long before they reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive structure made of wood, bone, and stone. It looked like a fort, a place of protection and power. The women entered the structure, and John was ushered inside. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The air was heavy, and the walls were adorned with strange symbols and trophies. The women seemed to move with purpose, their eyes never leaving John as they arranged themselves around the room. John stood still, unsure of what would happen next. The leader woman spoke again, her voice harsh but commanding. He had no idea what she was saying, but one thing was clear: he was about to face the tribe's judgment. The fire crackled in the center of the tribal hall. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows on the walls made of wood and bone. John stood silently, surrounded by the women of the tribe. They watched him closely, their eyes never leaving him, their expressions unreadable. He didn't know what to expect, but the air felt thick with tension, and his pulse raced. The leader woman, the one with the commanding presence, stood before him. Her eyes glowed with a strange intensity, and her armor gleamed in the firelight. She crossed her arms, studying John as if trying to decide his fate. John swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He had no idea what these women wanted from him, or if he would even survive this night. His mind raced, trying to think of a way to escape, to communicate, but nothing came to him. He had nothing to offer them, nothing but his survival instincts. The leader woman, after what felt like an eternity, finally spoke in that harsh foreign language. John couldn't understand her, but he knew she was saying something important. Her tone was commanding, and the others listened intently. He couldn't make sense of it, but he had the sinking feeling that his life depended on what came next. Then, unexpectedly, a voice broke through the tension. "You don't have to worry," said a soft voice from the back of the room. John turned to see a young woman stepping forward. She was shorter than the others, with soft features and long hair that hung loosely around her shoulders. Unlike the others, she didn't wear the same heavy armor. Her clothes were simpler, made from leather and cloth, and her eyes, though sharp, held a gentleness that was different from the fierce women surrounding her. The young woman smiled faintly at John, and for the first time since his arrival on the planet, he felt a flicker of hope. She seemed different from the rest. While the others had treated him like an outsider, she appeared to be offering him something. An understanding, perhaps, or at least a moment of peace in the chaos. "I'm Kira," she said softly, her voice a stark contrast to the harsh tones of the others. "Don't be afraid. I will try to help you." John's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected kindness in this strange place. The women around him were dangerous, their eyes cold and unfeeling. But Kira seemed different. There was a warmth in her gaze, a quiet strength that he couldn't ignore. "You speak my language?" John asked, his voice cautious but filled with hope. Kira nodded. "I've learned some. My people, they don't understand outsiders. But I do." She paused for a moment, then added, "You don't belong here, but I believe you can survive if you listen." John let out a slow breath. He wasn't sure if he should trust her, but he had little choice. This was his first real chance at understanding this world. "What's going on? What do they want from me?" he asked. Kira glanced over at the leader woman, who had been watching their exchange in silence. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't interrupt. Kira continued, her voice low. "They believe you're a sign from the gods, a human sent to serve or die. They follow old ways, traditions that are harsh and unforgiving. You have two choices, John. Serve them or be sacrificed." John felt his stomach twist in knots. Serve them. He wasn't sure he understood what that meant, but he didn't like the sound of it. Sacrificed. He shook his head. He wasn't ready to die, not without a fight. "Serve them how?" John asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Kira hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the leader woman before speaking. "You will be their slave, their servant. You'll hunt for them, gather food, and obey their commands. If you refuse, they will end your life." John felt a surge of anger at the thought. He wasn't a slave, and he would never willingly become one. But the reality of his situation hit him hard. He was alone, stranded on an alien planet, and he didn't know how to escape. Fighting back wasn't an option, not yet. The women were powerful, and John was weak from the crash and the strain of surviving on this harsh world. Kira must have seen the conflict in John's eyes, because she spoke again, this time more urgently. "But there's another way, a way you might be able to change things." John leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" She looked around cautiously, then spoke in a whisper. "There are those among us who want change. The old ways are killing us, and not everyone agrees with the leader's rule. Shira," she nodded toward the leader woman, "wants to keep things the way they've always been. But some of us believe that things can be different." John's mind raced. Could Kira be trusted? Was this a trap? He didn't know, but he also knew that if he was to survive, he needed to find out more. He couldn't just lie down and accept his fate. He had to find a way to make it out of here, and maybe Kira was the key. "Why are you telling me this?" John asked, his voice low. Kira glanced at the leader again, who was still watching them closely. "Because I believe you have something we don't. You have knowledge of the outside world. You can help us, and in return, I can help you survive." John considered her words carefully. Could he really trust her? He had no other choice but to take the risk. If there was a chance to escape, to survive, it was worth it. "I'll do what I can," John said quietly. "But I need your help, and I need to understand more. What's going on with the tribe?" Why are they so fierce? Kira nodded, her expression serious. I'll explain everything, but we need to be careful. The tribe is watching, and we can't trust anyone except each other. For the first time since his crash, John felt a spark of hope. Kira might be the ally he needed to survive. Together, they might be able to change things in this savage world. The fire crackled softly in the center of the tribal hall, casting flickering shadows against the walls. John sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the flames, his mind spinning with everything Kira had told him. He was caught in a dangerous situation. The tribe saw him as either a servant or a sacrifice. There was no middle ground. The rules were clear, and he didn't have the strength or resources to escape. Yet, Kira had offered him an out, a chance to change things, to resist. John's thoughts drifted back to the moment he had first seen the leader, Shura. Her eyes were sharp, filled with power and authority. She had made it clear that he had no choice but to obey. It was a harsh world, but Kira's words echoed in his mind. There's another way. The question now was whether he could trust Kira, and whether defying the tribe would be the right choice. He glanced at Kira, who sat across from him, her gaze thoughtful. The firelight reflected in her eyes, giving her a mysterious, almost otherworldly look. She had offered him hope, but he knew that hope came with a price. She had spoken of rebellion, of those who didn't agree with Shura's rule, but how far could he go? Was he really ready to fight against the tribe? I don't want to be their servant, John said quietly, his voice steady. I didn't crash here to become someone's slave. Kira nodded. I understand. But you're not the only one who feels that way. Many of us believe that things should change, that we should not have to live under Shura's rule. But the path is dangerous. If we are discovered, we will all suffer. John's heart pounded in his chest. He had no choice but to play along for now. The idea of becoming a servant, of hunting and gathering for these women, made his stomach twist in disgust. But he couldn't risk openly defying them just yet. He had to stay alive. I'll do what I must to survive, John said, his voice quieter now. But I need to know more about what's really going on with this tribe. What's the truth about Shura and her leadership? Kira hesitated for a moment before speaking. Shura's power comes from tradition. The tribe has always followed her because they believe she is chosen by the gods. She leads with fear. She rules with strength. But there are others, people like me, who think the old ways are destroying us. We can't survive if we keep living like this. John leaned forward, intrigued. What do you want to do about it? How can I help? Kira looked around nervously before leaning in closer. We need to take action. If we wait too long, things will only get worse. But Shura's followers are many. She's not just a leader, she's a symbol. If we move too soon, we risk everything. But if we wait, we risk nothing changing. John nodded slowly. He didn't fully understand what was happening here, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stand idly by. He wasn't going to let fear rule him. He had already survived a crash, faced dangerous creatures, and made it this far. He could handle more. What do you need from me? John asked. Kira's eyes flickered with something John couldn't quite read. We need someone who can understand strategy, someone who can help us fight back. Shura is strong, but she's not invincible. If we work together, we can take her down. John's mind raced as he thought about her words. Fighting Shura, challenging the tribe's laws, it was madness. But madness was sometimes the only way to make a change. He could run, he could hide, but he wouldn't survive long on this planet. His only chance at freedom was through Kira and the others who wanted change. I'm in, John said, surprising even himself. What's the first step? Kira's expression softened, and for the first time, John saw a flicker of relief in her eyes. We'll start by gaining trust. We need to make the others believe that you're on our side. The leader won't be fooled easily, but the rest of the tribe, they might listen. John nodded. Gaining trust. It seemed simple enough, but he knew it would be anything but. The women of the tribe were fierce, loyal to Shira and her ways. He would need to be careful. "Will Shira notice me?" John asked, his voice low. Kira shook her head. "Not at first. But she's always watching. Her eyes are everywhere. We'll have to be discreet. You need to follow her rules, at least for now. You need to play the part of the servant. Only then can we act." John understood. It was a dangerous game. But what choice did he have? He wasn't about to let his fate be decided by Shira's cruel laws. The next few days passed in a blur. John did as Kira advised, blending in as much as he could with the tribe. He performed tasks for the women, collecting firewood, fetching water, and assisting with the hunt. It wasn't easy, and it didn't sit well with him, but he did it. He needed to be patient, to wait for the right moment. During this time, he began to learn more about the tribe and its customs. There was a hierarchy, a system that favored strength above all else. The strongest women held the most power, and Shira ruled at the top, unchallenged. But beneath her were the others, the ones who had begun to question her leadership. John spent time with Kira, speaking in hushed tones when they could. They spoke of the rebellion, of how they could slowly turn the tribe's mindset. But John knew it wouldn't be easy. There were many risks. Every moment in the camp felt like a tightrope walk, with danger lurking around every corner. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Kira turned to John. "You must be careful," she warned, her voice urgent. "Shira has spies everywhere. If she suspects anything, we'll all be in danger." John nodded. He knew the stakes were high, but he was determined. He wasn't just going to survive. He was going to change this world. The sun rose high in the sky, casting a harsh light over the tribal camp. John stood by the fire, watching the women move about, gathering food, preparing weapons, and performing other tasks. He had learned the rhythm of the camp, the unspoken rules that governed everything here. He knew his place, and he knew what was expected of him. But it didn't make him feel any less trapped. He wasn't a servant by nature. He wasn't born to obey. Yet he played the part for survival. Each day, he worked harder, trying to blend in, to earn the tribe's trust. He gathered firewood, helped repair the huts, and fetched water from the stream. But every task he did made him feel more like an outsider, more like a prisoner. Kira watched him closely. She had become his closest ally in the tribe, and he trusted her. They had spoken in hushed whispers by the fire, discussing the future, the rebellion, the possibility of taking down Shira. But John knew it was still too soon. The time to act had not yet come. He had to be careful. Every move counted. John had learned one thing very quickly. Shira was not an easy leader to overthrow. She ruled with an iron fist. Her authority was absolute. Anyone who challenged her would be crushed without mercy. And John was no warrior. He was a man lost in a foreign world, with nothing but his wits to help him survive. Still, Kira had given him hope. She had shown him that not everyone in the tribe was loyal to Shira. There were whispers of rebellion, of those who wanted to see change. But the rebels were few, and they were too scared to act openly. Shira's grip on the tribe was strong, and she kept her enemies close, watching for signs of betrayal. John knew he had to play the long game. He couldn't make any moves too soon. Every day, he had to pretend to be one of them, pretending to accept the role they had forced him into. But deep inside, he was planning for the day when he would have enough support to fight back. That day might be closer than he thought. One afternoon, as John worked with the other women to prepare food, Kira approached him quietly. Her face was serious, her eyes scanning the camp before meeting his. "It's time," Kira whispered. "We can't wait any longer." John's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've waited long enough. Shira's spies are everywhere. If we don't act soon, she will know we're planning something. It's now or never." John looked around. The women were too busy to notice their conversation, but the air was thick with tension. He could feel it. Every moment felt like a countdown. "I'm not ready," John said, his voice low. "I can't take on the whole tribe by myself. I'm just one man." "You're not alone," Kira said, her voice firm. "You've earned the trust of some of the others. They're ready to follow you. They want change, just like you." John didn't know if he was ready for this. He had barely survived the crash. He had barely figured out how to live in this alien world. And now Kira was asking him to lead a rebellion, to take on a tribe of savage women. The thought terrified him, but he couldn't back down now. "I'll do it," John said, his voice more confident than he felt. "But we need to be careful. We can't risk an all-out attack." Kira nodded. "I know. We need to move in secret. We'll start small, gather support. But if we don't act soon, the tribe will fall apart anyway. Shura's rule is weakening." John couldn't argue with that. He had seen the cracks in Shura's leadership. The women in the tribe were divided, and Shura's harsh ways were starting to take a toll. There was fear, but there was also anger. If John could reach those women, he could build a force strong enough to challenge Shura's rule. But the question was, how? "We start by speaking to those who are already with us," Kira said, reading his thoughts. "We find the women who are discontent and show them they have a choice. We show them that Shura's reign is not the only way." John nodded slowly. He could see the plan beginning to take shape. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A spark of hope in a world that seemed lost. "I'll speak to the hunters," John said. "They're the ones who have the most influence. If they can see the truth, they can help us spread the word." Kira smiled. "Good, but be careful, John. If you move too quickly, Shura will know. We have to be subtle." John didn't need to be told twice. He knew that if they acted too soon, they would all be in danger. He had to move cautiously, gathering support without drawing attention to himself. The next few days were a blur of careful planning and quiet conversations. John spoke to the hunters and the other women who seemed unhappy with Shura's rule. At first, they were hesitant, unsure whether they could trust him. But John had earned their respect through his hard work, and Kira's words had already planted the seed of doubt in their minds. John could feel the tension building. The tribe was on the edge of something. The women who followed Shura were still loyal, but they were growing uneasy. The whispers of rebellion were spreading, and Shura could sense it. She was watching John more closely than ever, and he could feel her eyes on him at all times. John had to be careful. He had to stay one step ahead of her. One evening, as the sun set and the camp grew quiet, John sat by the fire, his mind racing. He had gathered a small group of women who were ready to act. Kira was with him, her face determined. "Tonight," John said, his voice barely a whisper, "tonight, we make our move." Kira nodded. "We strike before Shura can strike first." John knew this was the moment. He could feel it in his bones. The time had come to challenge Shura's rule, to take a stand against the tribe that had held him captive for so long. But even as he spoke the words, John knew the danger. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. But there was no turning back now. The night was still, the camp quiet as most of the tribe rested. The stars above were clear, casting a pale light over the ground. John sat by the fire, his thoughts racing. Tonight was the night. The time had come to make his move, to take a stand against Shura's oppressive rule. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. Kira had gathered a small group of women who were ready to fight, ready to stand with John. These women had grown tired of Shura's harsh leadership and had chosen to trust him, to believe in the change that was possible. But the group was small. The risk was high. John knew that the slightest mistake could lead to disaster. If Shura found out what they were planning, it would be the end of everything. The tribe was loyal to her, and anyone who went against her was seen as a traitor. But John couldn't back down now, not when there was a chance to change everything. Kira approached John, her expression calm but serious. She was ready for what was coming, but John could see the worry in her eyes. She knew that even with their small group, they could never win against Shira's full force. "We're ready," Kira whispered. "The others are in position. We move on your signal." John nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the soft sounds of the camp around him, women talking in low voices, the crackle of the fire, the distant howls of creatures in the wilderness. But tonight, all that mattered was the rebellion they were about to begin. The chance to overthrow Shira. John stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had never been in a situation like this before. He was no leader, but he had no choice. The tribe had to be freed. He glanced over at the women who had joined him. There were 5 of them in total, Kira, and 4 others who had quietly pledged their support. They had all worked hard to build trust and spread the idea of rebellion. But now, the time for talking was over. They had to act. John signaled to Kira, and she moved quickly, disappearing into the shadows of the camp. The others followed her, each one carrying out their part of the plan. John stood still, watching, waiting for the right moment. His heart was in his throat as he waited for the signal. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the ground. Everything felt too quiet, too still, the calm before the storm. Then, just as John began to wonder if something had gone wrong, Kira's voice came softly through the night air. Now, the signal was given. The rebellion had begun. John moved quickly, his heart racing. He had no time to think, no time to second-guess himself. The women of the tribe had to be shown that Shira's rule could be overthrown. They had to see that they had a choice. He ran to the edge of the camp, where Kira had gathered the women who were ready to act. The small group of rebels moved swiftly and silently, moving in unison as they took their positions around the camp. John could see the fear in their eyes, but there was also determination. They had chosen this path, and there was no turning back. Kira came to John's side, her face tense but focused. "We need to take control of the center. If we can get to the main fire, we can hold the tribe off long enough for the others to join us." John nodded. He had thought of that. The central fire was where Shira would be. If they could control it, they could cut off her power and force her to listen. But as John made his way toward the center of the camp, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. Shira's spies were already on alert. They had seen the movement and were trying to stop it before it could spread. A loud shout broke the silence. "Intruders!" a woman cried. The camp was awake now, the sounds of alarm echoing through the air. John's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. The rebellion had begun, and there was no turning back. Shira's warriors, women who were loyal to her above all else, rushed toward the center of the camp. They were strong, fierce, and ready to fight. John could see them coming, but he didn't back down. He wasn't going to run. Not this time. The small group of rebels stood firm, holding their ground. The first clash came quickly, as the warriors of Shira's tribe charged at them. John's breath caught in his chest as the women fought with strength and skill. But the rebels were outnumbered, and the warriors were powerful. John knew they needed to hold the line long enough for more supporters to join them. Kira was in the front, shouting orders, leading the charge. She was a force to be reckoned with, her eyes blazing with determination. John had to stay close to her. He had to trust her. John's mind raced as the battle began. He wasn't a fighter, but he couldn't just stand there. He grabbed a stick from the ground, wielding it like a weapon. He swung it at one of the approaching warriors, knocking her back. It wasn't much, but it bought him a few precious seconds. The fight was chaotic, and John's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't see everything, but he could hear the sounds of struggle, shouts, the clash of weapons, the grunts of women fighting for their lives. The air was thick with tension. John spotted Shira in the center of the camp, watching the chaos unfold with cold eyes. She wasn't fighting. She was waiting for her warriors to crush the rebellion. John knew that if he didn't act quickly, they would lose. He made his way toward her, dodging the fighting women around him. His heart was in his throat as he approached. This was it, the moment of truth. He had to face her, and he had to make her listen. "Shira," John called out, his voice carrying over the noise of the battle. "This doesn't have to end like this. You can stop this madness." Shira's cold eyes locked onto him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her expression was enough. She wasn't afraid of him. She was a leader, a warrior. She was ready to fight to the end. John took a deep breath. The battle was far from over, but he had taken the first step. The chaos of battle raged around John. His heart pounded as he moved quickly, dodging strikes from the loyal warriors of Shira. The air was thick with dust and the sound of clashing weapons. John's legs felt heavy, and his breath came in sharp gasps. But he pushed on. There was no turning back now. The rebellion had begun, and the stakes had never been higher. Kira fought beside him, her movements precise and powerful. She was a true warrior. Every strike aimed to disable, not to kill. She moved with confidence, her eyes scanning the battlefield as she led the charge. John could feel the weight of her presence, her determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a future, a chance for freedom. John's mind raced. He had never imagined himself in a fight like this. Back on Earth, he had been just a regular man, an engineer, a problem solver. But now, he was caught in the middle of a war between tribes of alien women, each struggling for power. John had never wanted this, but it was the reality he had to face. His eyes briefly met Kira's as she cut down another warrior. She gave him a small nod, urging him forward. John didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He had to face Shira. The only way to end this was to confront her. Through the smoke and dust of the battlefield, John finally saw her. Shira stood tall and proud, her eyes locked onto him as if she had been waiting for this moment. Her warriors fought fiercely around her, but she was not engaged in the battle. She was watching him, studying him. John's heart beat faster. This was it, the final moment. He had no more tricks, no more plans. It was just him and Shira. He moved toward her, stepping carefully through the chaos. Every instinct told him to keep his guard up, to be ready for anything. But as he got closer, he saw something in her eyes. It wasn't fear, it was something else, something like curiosity. When he reached her, the fighting seemed to slow down, as if the very air held its breath. "Shira," John said, his voice strong, but not without a hint of uncertainty. "It doesn't have to be this way. You've led through fear, but you don't have to. You can choose a different path, a path where we all live, where we all have a say." Shira's cold gaze never left him. She stood taller than any of the other women, her body strong and unyielding. She was a leader, and she had led her tribe to greatness through force. But now, in this moment, John could see the cracks in her armor. She wasn't as certain as she once had been. "You speak of choice, human," Shira said, her voice low and commanding. "But you do not understand our ways. You are an outsider, a weak man with no place here. You do not belong." "I may not belong here, but I belong to something," John replied, his voice steady. "I belong to the idea that we can all live in peace, that we can all have a voice. You're not just a leader. You're a woman who can choose to change." Shira studied him for a long moment. John could see the anger in her eyes, the fire that had driven her to conquer and control. But beneath it, there was something else, something that flickered like a dying ember. "You are brave," Shira said after a long pause. "I will give you that, but your words mean nothing here. I will not bow to you." John took a deep breath. He knew that this wasn't about bowing or winning. It was about showing Shira that there was another way. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You don't have to bow to me," John said softly, his eyes locked on hers. "But you have to listen. The women in your tribe, your people, are tired. They're tired of living in fear. You have the power to change everything. You have the power to give them a choice. Shira's eyes narrowed, her hands clenched into fists. John didn't know if he had reached her or if she was about to strike him down. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. For a moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to stop, the battle around them fading into the background. John stood before Shira, waiting, hoping, praying that she would see reason. Finally, Shira spoke, her voice quieter now, more uncertain than it had ever been. You think I do not know this. You think I do not see the cracks in my rule. I have led for so long. I have made decisions, difficult ones, and I do not know if I can change. John's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. He had to press on. Everyone can change, Shira, John said, his voice calm. You're not the same woman you were when you first took control. Neither are we. You can lead with wisdom, with strength that doesn't come from fear. Shira was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she lowered her head. The weight of her decision was heavy, but John could see her hesitation, the shift in her mind. The fire that had once burned so brightly in her eyes now flickered uncertain. I will listen, Shira said finally, her voice softer than John had ever heard it. But know this, there will be no easy path forward. This tribe is not ready for what you suggest. John nodded. I know, but we can start together. We can rebuild. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. Shira stepped back, her warriors waiting for her command. The battle had stopped, and now the camp was eerily quiet. John didn't know what the future held, but he had taken the first step. He had shown Shira that there was another way. And now they could begin to rebuild the tribe, to build a future that was not based on fear and control. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, John looked around at the women who had fought beside him. There was a sense of hope in the air, a new beginning. The battle was over, but the real work was just beginning. And for the first time, John felt that he was truly home. Not just on this strange world, but in the fight for something better, for the future of the tribe, and for his own future.